Former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper has been a leading, outspoken, and courageous voice in strong support of a strong Israel. His deeds have matched his words. No ally worked harder with the United States over that period of time to build international opposition to Iran's nuclear program, and he demonstrated that he was a true friend of the Jewish state. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
That's a nice walk.
Welcome to Washington.
It's nice to be here.
Was that unbelievable and moving?
That was
what
wonderful.
We just heard?
Tremendous.
What drives your commitment and your passion for this issue, this cause,
Sure.
this country?
Yeah, I get that, Frank. I get that. I got that question all the time. I guess, let me begin with the sad part of that.
Okay.
A couple of generations ago, somebody would have asked a politician why they didn't have that kind of support of Israel, and that's where we need to get back to. But look, I always said this, I did not take these positions as a favor to the state of Israel. I took the positions I took because I believed them to be in the best interests of my country, of Canada. You know, we're in a world where Israel is one of the family, in my view, family of Western democratic nations. And we have common threats, we have common interests, but particularly common threats. And I tell people, what is the difference between our values and Israel's? None. What is the difference between the threats we face? The only difference between the threats we face in Canada, you face in the United States, our allies face, and Israel, is that Israel is much closer to those threats than we are. And so I believed as Prime Minister of Canada, we have a very simple choice. We stand by Israel and we stand against those threats, or we watch those threats come daily to our own shores. And that is why I believe so strongly that as Canadians and Americans, all Western countries, it is in our absolute vital interest to stand by the state of Israel.
So, as you look back on your tenure as Prime Minister, what do you now consider to be your top priorities and achievements in that bilateral Canadian-Israeli relationship?
Look, I could point to a lot of small things. I mean, one of the things I consider small in a way because it was more a personal honor. I was the first Canadian Prime Minister ever to speak to the Knesset and to get a key to the Knesset.
Prime Minister ever.
Yeah. We modernized our free trade agreement. There's a number of bilateral initiatives we undertook in terms of science and technology, other things. But the two things I'm most proud of are these, and I know one very strongly supported here. Our government, the government I led, John Barrett, our Foreign Affairs Minister, we consistently, give him a hand. We consistently refuse to be bullied into signing one-sided international resolutions against the state of Israel. And I'm very proud of that, because it was the right thing to do, but also because we took those stands and because we made strong and I think convincing arguments for those stands that ultimately brought the majority of Canadians around to our side. That has made it very difficult for a future government to move away from those kinds of positions.
I'm very interested in the word you used. You said we refuse to be bullied.
Right.
Bullied?
Yeah, look, I guess what I call bullying, Frank, is this. I call it argumentation without actually using compelling arguments. You see this all the time in international affairs and many things, where people try to convince you you should agree to something simply because everyone else is doing it, and just peer pressure alone. And I guess I'm the kind of guy that by nature, if someone presents me with an argument, and I don't agree with it, and they resort to what I call bullying, resort to kind of pressure as opposed to persuasive arguments, I tend to actually dig in more strongly. And I became more and more convinced on this issue that my positions were correct. What happened, frankly, was I noticed over time that other countries basically ceased trying to change my view on this. They knew I wasn't going to change my view. In fact, what's distressing is privately the number of leaders who agreed with my view but simply didn't want to break consensus because consensus was so important to them.
Well, politics and diplomacy collide, right?
Yeah.
What can be done, in your view, to address the anti-Israel criticisms and resolutions that churn up in these international organizations, United Nations and elsewhere? Can you offer any people in the room here, Israelis and others, any perspective and even hope about that, because it's as predictable as the sunrise?
Yeah, and look, it's getting worse and worse on a certain level. Look, my father always used to say, when it comes to the United Nations, we just have to accept the United Nations for what it is. I mean, we as conservatives often are kind of outraged at the conduct of the United Nations on such and such an issue. But what is the United Nations? The United Nations is not a group of democratic nations. The United Nations is not a meeting of our allies. The United Nations is the one forum in the world that includes everybody, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, you know, when the vast majority of members of the United Nations don't subscribe to what we would consider as basic human rights, it's hard to imagine how their Human Rights Council could come to decisions that we would find as democratic nations terribly pleasing. So, but look, it is outrageous. It is outrageous that, just one example, I know others know these things, but outrageous that in the United Nations Human Rights Council, the one and only country in the world that is the subject of a permanent agenda item is Israel, one of the freest nations in the world by any standards. Yet there is virtual hero worship there of the Palestinian Authority, whose leader has had no democratic mandate in 12 years, and who rules by decree because there is no elected legislature of any kind. No outrage about that whatsoever. So, look, I don't think we can change the complexion of the United Nations, but none of that, I tell my friends here and in Canada, none of that is an excuse for Western leaders, for the leaders of our countries, not standing up for what is right and in our own interests and defending one of our most vital allies, the State of Israel. I will also say this, that notwithstanding the worsening atmosphere at the United Nations, what was said earlier tonight, below the radar, there are a greater and greater number and depth of bilateral relations between Israel and the growing number of countries around the world. That is real success. It will eventually turn that, and I think the President Government of Israel deserves a lot of compliments for that success.
Well, and we heard that earlier today when we were speaking to leaders from Africa who are setting up summits with Israel and moving on a number of fronts, just one place. In your view, you now have, you're freed from the burden of leadership, so you can say whatever you want, right? What do you feel?
That's what journalists always tell you.
That's you just have a few friends in the room. But on a serious note, what is the greatest threat as you look at the region now facing Israel, and for that matter, the West as a whole, in today's Middle East?
There are, I think, three threats to Israel of real significance. The first, and by far the most pressing, because it is the one sort of existential strategic threat to Israel, and that is the Iranian regime. It's the possibility that regime could obtain nuclear weapons. It is, you know, if you look at Israel's history from 1947, for so much of that period, there were existential threats to Israel right on its borders. That simply doesn't exist today. There are bad groups, there are terrorists who can fire rockets and create a certain amount of havoc and kidnappings or injuries, but they don't threaten Israel and the way Israel was threatened in the 1960s, 1970s when I was a boy and a young man. That existential threat alone is the government of Iran. Look, how we really stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is, something that, frankly, has always been above the capacity of the government of Canada. But I just think it is critical that this country, and that with the support of our allies, that we do everything in our power, whatever step is ultimately necessary, to stop that fanatical regime from ever achieving nuclear weapons capability. Second threat, longer term, not as immediate, but the spread of that sort of Shia theocracy, the spread of Sunni jihadism in the region, doesn't threaten Israel today, but it obviously threatens virtually every state in that region. And there is certainly a danger that if we can't contain or control this over time, that Israel just becomes surrounded by this enormous range of ungoverned spaces with groups of that kind of fanaticism. So that's an obvious second problem. Requires our considered interventions. It's why, as Prime Minister of Canada, we supported the previous administration's efforts in Iran or in Iraq and Syria against ISIS. Now, the third threat to Israel is the one I think we actually need to take the most serious as Canadians and as Americans, and that is the BDS movement. There has been, I have seen this in my political lifetime, the BDS movement being the principal vehicle. One can disagree with the Israeli government's policies in this aspect or that. But the BDS movement is not about that. The BDS movement is about translating the old ideology of anti-Semitism into something acceptable to a new generation. The BDS movement in calling for the boycott, sanctions, and divesting in Israel, the BDS movement in doing things like trying to have Israeli academics expelled or not allowed, having Jewish students harassed, these are its realities. My son, came home from his university campus a couple of years ago and showed me a sign by the BDS movement, Star of David with a slash through it. The whole thing could have come from Berlin in 1938. It is incumbent on all of us. There are times, particularly as Canadians, but there are times when we see things we disagree with, we act with excessive politeness. When we see people who advocate that movement and who say these kinds of things, it is incumbent on all of us to be as vocal and as loud and as pointed in our denunciations as we can possibly be.
Prime Minister, you have had a unique view of history and a unique voice, and we thank you for that, and we thank you for your time here this evening and for your clear-eyed vision and your comments. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.